He'd saved 47 lives in combat zones across 3 continents. But here on Maple Drive, Marcus couldn't even get a good morning from his neighbors. They whispered when he walked by, pulled their children inside when he appeared. What they didn't realize was that they were living next to someone extraordinary. Someone whose name was whispered with respect in military circles worldwide. And when evil came knocking on their doors, they were about to learn why. Welcome to True Story Zone, where real heroism and justice unfold. Let's discover what really happened. Rosewood Hills, Ohio had perfect lawns, white picket fences, and carefully manicured flower beds stretching as far as the eye could see. This neighborhood was the American dream made concrete, safe, clean, and overwhelmingly white. When Marcus Williams moved into 47 Maple Drive 8 months ago, he had disrupted that carefully maintained demographic. Marcus was 52 years old, a distinguished black man with graying temples and an upright military posture that spoke of decades of discipline. He had neatly trimmed hair, weathered hands that told stories of service, and a daily ritual of stepping out at exactly 6:47 a.m. to collect his newspaper from the pristine white mailbox. His house was always spotless, his yard perfectly maintained with military precision. He was polite and respectful toward his neighbors, always offering a courteous nod or quiet good morning that was never returned. But in Rosewood Hills, being different, being black in a sea of white faces, meant being invisible at best, unwelcome at worst. Mrs. Rebecca Patterson, the blonde soccer mom living at 45 Maple Drive, would pull her 8-year-old twins Emma and Ethan inside whenever she spotted Marcus through her kitchen window. She'd watch him from behind her curtains, whispering to her husband about property values and neighborhood changes. Mr. Robert Henderson, the retired bank manager at 49, avoided eye contact entirely. He'd hurry his daily walks, turning his head away whenever Marcus appeared, clutching his morning coffee like a shield against an uncomfortable reality he refused to acknowledge. The Thompson family at 52, Jack and Linda Thompson, with their twin 10-year-old daughters Katie and Sarah, acted as if Marcus didn't exist at all. They'd organized block parties, neighborhood barbecues, and holiday decorating contests without a single invitation extended to the man at 47. Their children had been quietly instructed to stay away from that house without explanation. Neighborhood watch meetings weren't announced to him. Community Facebook groups somehow never included his address. Marcus had become a ghost on his own street, visible only when his presence made others uncomfortable. But ghosts sometimes carry the most powerful secrets. Tuesday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made Rosewood Hills look like a postcard. Marcus stepped out at his usual 6:47 a.m., wearing his customary green flannel shirt, clean jeans, and military precision laced black boots. His dark skin caught the early morning light as he walked with measured steps toward his mailbox, a routine he'd maintained without fail for 8 months. As he reached for his newspaper, he heard Mrs. Patterson's voice from number 45, sharp with urgency. "Emma, Ethan, come inside right now," she called to her twins, who had been playing with sidewalk chalk in their driveway. The children looked up confused. They just started their game, but their mother's tone brooked no argument. Marcus collected his paper, the headline reading Local Veterans Group Honors Service Members, and turned toward Mrs. Patterson with a polite nod. "Beautiful morning, Mrs. Patterson." She averted her eyes completely, ushering her children into the house without acknowledgement. The front door closed with deliberate finality, leaving Marcus standing alone on the sidewalk. This daily routine had become a cold war that neither side acknowledged, but both sides felt. As Marcus walked back toward his house, he noticed Mr. Henderson at number 49 suddenly finding urgent business with his garden hose, turning his back completely as Marcus passed. The snub was so obvious, so deliberate, that it would have been almost comical if it weren't so consistently cruel. At noon, while Marcus was trimming his hedges with the same precision he'd once used to maintain military equipment, Mr. Henderson was watering his garden when he saw Marcus's car pulling out of the garage. A black, older model Jeep Wrangler, pristine and well-maintained but deliberately modest. No military stickers, no decorations, no indication of the man's extraordinary past. Henderson's face twisted with what looked like disgust, and he turned the hose away as if Marcus's mere presence might contaminate his property. The afternoon brought school dismissal time, and the Thompson twins Katie and Sarah came running down the street, their backpacks bouncing as they raced toward number 52. They slowed as they passed Marcus's house, curious about the man they'd been told to avoid. Marcus looked up from his yard work and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Afternoon, girls. How was school?" The twins stopped, Katie opening her mouth to respond, but Linda Thompson's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Girls, come here immediately. Don't talk to strangers." The word strangers hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd lived 4 houses down for 8 months. He'd never spoken an unkind word, never caused a disturbance, never done anything except try to be a good neighbor. But to Linda Thompson, his black skin made him perpetually foreign, perpetually dangerous, perpetually unwelcome. The girls ran to their mother, confusion evident on their young faces. Linda Thompson gathered them close, shooting a look of pure disdain toward Marcus before hurrying them inside. The message was clear. This black man, regardless of his character or actions, was a threat to be avoided. Marcus's isolation was deepening with each passing day. But this isolation had prepared him in ways his neighbors couldn't imagine. To wait, to watch, to assess threats, and to act with lethal precision when necessary. Wednesday evening at 9:30 p.m., the tranquil facade of Maple Drive began to crack. Marcus sat on his front porch, as was his custom, reading the local newspaper by the warm glow of his porch light. The street was peaceful, lined with luxury cars and manicured lawns that spoke of suburban prosperity and security. Then came a van. A black Chevrolet Express with tinted windows and no visible license plates cruised slowly down Maple Drive. Too slowly. Marcus's military training kicked in immediately. This wasn't a lost delivery driver or a visiting relative. This was surveillance. The vehicle moved at precisely 15 miles per hour, windows down just enough for occupants to get clear sight lines of each house. Marcus remained perfectly still, but his eyes tracked every detail. 3 occupants, driver wearing a dark baseball cap, passenger taking photos with a telephoto lens, someone in the back seat making notes on what appeared to be a tablet. The van stopped directly across from number 52, the Thompson house. 2 figures emerged. Young men, early 20s, wearing hooded sweatshirts despite the warm evening. One immediately began a systematic survey of the property, checking sight lines, noting the positions of windows, identifying potential entry points. The other made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones while gesturing toward the house. Marcus memorized everything, height and build of both subjects, their clothing, their mannerisms, the way they moved with practiced efficiency. These weren't random criminals or teenage troublemakers. This was professional reconnaissance. After exactly 5 minutes, long enough to gather intelligence, short enough to avoid detection by most residents, the men returned to the van and departed. But Marcus had seen enough to know that Maple Drive was about to become a very dangerous place. The next morning, Thursday, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. As Mrs. Patterson emerged to collect her own newspaper, he approached her, the first time in 8 months he'd initiated contact. "Excuse me, Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of authority that made her look up despite herself. She clutched her newspaper like a shield, taking an instinctive step backward. "What do you want? Did you see anything unusual last night?" Around 9:30, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you ask me that?" "There was a van. Black, no plates." They were surveying the Thompson house for 5 minutes. Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. Despite her prejudices, the seriousness in Marcus's voice was undeniable. You were watching. I was reading on my porch." They stopped right in front of your neighbor's house and conducted what looked like criminal reconnaissance. The word criminal hit her like cold water. "What do you mean, reconnaissance?" Marcus's voice remained steady, professional. "Ma'am, I'm suggesting you call the police and inform the Thompsons. What I witnessed last night was textbook pre-crime surveillance." Mrs. Patterson stared at him, seeing perhaps for the first time not just the black man she'd been avoiding, but someone speaking with unmistakable expertise about something terrifying. How would you know about such things?" Marcus simply nodded toward the Thompson house. "Just make the call, ma'am. And tell them to be extra careful tonight." It was their first real conversation in 8 months. But it wouldn't be their last. Friday evening at 10:45 p.m., Marcus was in light sleep, the kind learned in combat zones where relaxation was a luxury that could get you killed. His bedroom window faced the street, curtains positioned to allow observation while maintaining concealment. Years of military training had taught him that safety was an illusion, vigilance was survival. The sound that woke him wasn't loud, but it was wrong. A muffled crash, like furniture being overturned. Then a woman's scream, cut short and sharp. Then the rumble of multiple engines starting simultaneously. Marcus was out of bed and at the window in seconds. The Thompson house at 52 was lit up like a Christmas tree, every light blazing. The front door hung open, revealing chaos inside. 3 vehicles were positioned strategically around the property. The black van from Wednesday night, a dark sedan blocking the driveway, and a pickup truck idling at the corner, classic 3-point containment pattern. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was a coordinated military-style operation. Marcus moved with the efficiency of a man who'd been preparing for this moment his entire adult life. For his bedroom closet, he retrieved a black duffel bag that looked ordinary but contained equipment worth more than most people's cars. Tactical clothing designed for urban operations. Night vision goggles with thermal imaging capability. Communication gear that could patch into emergency frequencies. A tactical vest that had stopped bullets in 3 different countries. And finally, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the bag, a Glock 19 with custom modifications. Legal, registered, and maintained in perfect condition despite 15 years without use. As Marcus transformed from suburban neighbor into something altogether more dangerous, he considered his options. The smart play was to call 911 and let the professionals handle it. The safe play was to stay in his house and protect himself. But Marcus Williams had never been interested in smart or safe when innocent lives were at stake. Within 4 minutes, he had become someone his neighbors wouldn't recognize. The mild-mannered black man they'd spent 8 months ignoring had become a predator, and the hunters outside the Thompson house were about to become the hunted. But Marcus's neighbors had no idea what was happening just 4 houses away. And they certainly had no idea that the man they'd spent 8 months treating like a threat was about to become their salvation. What they were about to witness would shatter every assumption they'd made about the quiet black veteran they'd refused to acknowledge. Marcus moved through his backyard with the fluid silence of a man who'd infiltrated hostile territory more times than he cared to count. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, muscle memory taking over as if 15 years of civilian life had been nothing more than a brief intermission. He approached the Thompson house from the rear, using the privacy fence and mature oak trees for concealment. Through the back windows, he could see into the living room where the situation was unfolding with terrifying clarity. Jack Thompson was zip-tied to a dining room chair, duct tape over his mouth, blood trickling from his nose where he'd been struck. Linda Thompson stood pressed against the far wall, her face white with terror, hands raised in surrender. 2 armed men stood over them, one tall and thin with gang tattoos covering his neck, the other shorter and heavy-set with the dead eyes of someone who'd killed before. But Katie and Sarah, the 10-year-old twins, were nowhere to be seen. Marcus crept closer, positioning himself beneath the kitchen window to listen. The conversation inside made his blood run cold. "Where are the kids?" Neck Tattoos was demanding, pressing his pistol against Jack Thompson's temple. Linda Thompson's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're at their friend Jessica's house. Sleep over. They won't be back until tomorrow." "Bullshit," Deadeyes snarled. "Boss specifically wants the kids. That's the whole point. I swear to God, they're not here. Check the bedrooms, check anywhere you want." Marcus's military mind processed this information with clinical precision. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random home invasion. Someone had specifically targeted the Thompson children for kidnapping, and only the girls' absence had prevented a nightmare scenario. But the perpetrators didn't believe Linda Thompson's story, and Marcus could see the situation escalating toward torture and murder. He pulled out his cell phone and made a decision that would change Maple Drive forever. Instead of calling 911 directly, he dialed a number he'd memorized decades ago and never forgotten. "Emergency services, this is Operator 47. This is Marcus Williams, former Sergeant Major, U.S. Army Special Forces. Authorization code Phantom Alpha 779er. I need immediate priority dispatch to 52 Maple Drive, Rosewood Hills. Multiple armed suspects, hostages in immediate danger, request tactical support." There was a pause, then, "Sergeant Major Williams?" "Sir, your authorization code shows." "Sir, that's a Medal of Honor designation." "Confirmed. I have visual on suspects. I'm going operational. ETA on backup." "Sir, units are rolling hot. ETA at 6 minutes." "Sir, please maintain position until..." Marcus ended the call. 6 minutes was 5 minutes too long for the Thompsons to survive. Marcus approached the Thompson house like the weapon he'd once been. The back door was unlocked, careless, but these criminals had clearly expected no resistance from suburban families. He slipped inside through the kitchen, every sense hyper-alert, every movement calculated. The house layout was identical to his own, giving him a tactical advantage. He knew exactly where each room was, which floorboards creaked, where the sight lines would be best. The kitchen was empty, but voices carried from the living room 20 feet away. "I'm going to start cutting fingers off your husband until you tell me where those girls are," Deadeyes was saying. Marcus moved closer, positioning himself behind the kitchen island where he could observe without being seen. Neck Tattoos was standing near the front window, poor positioning that exposed him to multiple angles of attack. Deadeyes stood over Jack Thompson, brandishing a tactical knife that glinted in the lamplight. But there was a third voice Marcus hadn't accounted for, coming from upstairs. "Yo, Tommy. These bedrooms are empty, but there's kids' stuff everywhere. Clothes, toys, homework on the desk. They definitely live here. 3 hostels, not 2. Marcus adjusted his tactical plan accordingly. The third man, apparently Tommy, came down the stairs carrying a stuffed animal and a school backpack. "Found this shit in the girls' room. They were here recently. See." Deadeyes turned back to Linda Thompson. "You're lying. Where'd you hide them?" Marcus made his move. The first target was Neck Tattoos by the window, isolated, distracted, back turned. Marcus covered the distance in 3 silent steps, his arm locking around the man's throat in a blood choke that rendered him unconscious in 8 seconds. The gun clattered to the floor with barely a whisper. Tommy on the stairs heard something and turned, but Marcus was already moving. A single precise strike to the solar plexus doubled Tommy over, gasping for breath. A follow-up blow to the base of his skull sent him crashing down the remaining steps, unconscious before he hit the bottom. Deadeyes spun around at the commotion, knife in one hand, pistol in the other, and found himself facing something he'd never encountered before, a trained killer who moved like death itself. "Drop your weapons," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd given that command to terrorists and enemy combatants in a dozen different countries. Deadeyes looked at Marcus, a black man in tactical gear holding a military-grade pistol with the steady hands of a professional, and made the last mistake of his criminal career. "I don't know who the fuck you think you are, old man, but you just walked into the wrong house." He raised his gun. Marcus's response was instantaneous and final. 2-round center mass, textbook precision that would have made his drill instructors proud. Deadeyes dropped where he stood. The entire engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds. 3 armed criminals neutralized, hostages secure, threat eliminated. Jack and Linda Thompson stared at Marcus in complete shock, unable to process what they just witnessed. The mild-mannered black neighbor they'd spent 8 months avoiding had just saved their lives with a display of lethal competence that belonged in an action movie. But the real shock was still coming. Because when the SWAT teams arrived, when the police cars filled Maple Drive with flashing lights, when the entire neighborhood came out to see what was happening, they were all about to learn exactly who Marcus Williams really was. And that revelation would change everything. The sound of sirens filled Maple Drive like a symphony of salvation. Marcus had finished zip-tying the unconscious criminals with their own restraints when the front door exploded inward. "Police. Hands where we can see them." The SWAT team flooded the Thompson living room like a black-clad tide, automatic weapons trained on every corner, every shadow. Marcus immediately dropped his weapon and raised his hands, knowing that any sudden movement could be fatal. "I'm Marcus Williams, call sign Phantom. Suspects are secured." The SWAT commander, imposing man with 20 years of tactical experience, froze mid-step. He lowered his weapon and stared at Marcus as if seeing a ghost. "Williams? Sergeant Major Marcus Williams." "Affirmative." "Holy shit." The commander turned to his team. "Stand down. Stand down immediately. This is Sergeant Major Marcus Williams." The team leader pulled off his helmet, revealing a weathered face filled with something approaching. "Sir, I'm Captain Rodriguez, Franklin County SWAT." "Sir, it's an honor." By this time, commotion had drawn every resident of Maple Drive out of their homes. Mrs. Patterson stood on her front lawn in her bathrobe, clutching her twins. Mr. Henderson emerged from behind his curtains, coffee mug forgotten in his hand. Neighbors from 3 blocks away had heard the sirens and come to investigate. They all watched as Captain Rodriguez continued speaking to Marcus, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. Sir, are you the Marcus Williams? Fallujah, 2004. The Marcus Williams who held off an entire insurgent battalion for 16 hours to protect a refugee convoy. Marcus nodded quietly. That was a long time ago, Captain. Sir, you saved 47 civilians that day. Men, women, children. The Army's been teaching your tactics at Fort Benning for 20 years. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, drawn by the drama and the flashing lights. Mrs. Patterson was staring at Marcus with dawning comprehension. Mr. Henderson's mouth hung open. The very people who had spent 8 months treating Marcus like a threat were learning that they'd been living next to a living legend. Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice filled with professional respect. Sir, you're the first black Special Forces operator to receive the Medal of Honor since Vietnam. Your service record is classified, but what we do know. He paused, looking around at the assembled neighbors. This man is a genuine American hero. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Patterson's hands flew to her mouth. Mr. Henderson's coffee mug slipped from his fingers and shattered on his driveway. Linda Thompson, still shaking from her ordeal, stared at Marcus with tears streaming down her face. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Rodriguez announced to the crowd, let me introduce you to your neighbor. Sergeant Major Marcus Williams, United States Army Special Forces. Medal of Honor, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. The man who saved more American lives in combat than any single soldier in the last 50 years. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. These were the same people who had crossed the street to avoid Marcus, who had pulled their children inside when he appeared, who had whispered about property values and neighborhood safety. And all along, they had been living next to a man who had risked everything to save strangers half a world away. As the ambulances departed and the crime scene was processed, the neighborhood residents remained on Maple Drive, unable to return to their homes. They stood in small groups, talking in hushed voices, all of them stealing glances at Marcus, who was giving his statement to detectives. Mrs. Patterson was the first to approach. Her face was streaked with tears, her twins Emma and Ethan clinging to her hands. Marcus, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. Marcus looked up from the detective's notepad, his expression gentle despite everything that had happened. Mrs. Patterson, you don't need to say anything. No, I do. Her voice grew stronger, fueled by shame and determination. We treated you terribly. All of us. We judged you because... She struggled with the words. Because of your skin color. Because you were different. And we never gave you a chance. Mr. Henderson approached slowly, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked like devastation. Sir, we owe you an apology that can never be adequate. We treated you like a criminal, like a threat to our neighborhood. When all along, added Mrs. Patterson, you were the one person who could protect us when we really needed it. Marcus's voice was calm, without anger or bitterness. I'm just your neighbor. That's all I ever wanted to be. Jack Thompson, his face still bruised from the assault, approached with his wife Linda. His voice shook as he spoke. You saved our lives tonight. Our children's lives. And we... He couldn't finish the sentence. Linda Thompson was crying openly. We never even said hello to you. For 8 months, we treated you like you were invisible. Or worse, like you were dangerous. And you... She gestured helplessly at the crime scene. You risked everything for us. Your children are safe, Marcus said simply. That's what matters. More neighbors gathered around. People from the entire block who had maintained the cold wall of suburban segregation that had made Marcus a stranger in his own neighborhood. One by one, they began to speak. I'm ashamed, said Mrs. Foster from 3 houses down. We all are. We were wrong, added Mr. Bradley from across the street. So completely wrong. How do we make this right? Asked Mrs. Patterson. Marcus looked around at the circle of faces, white faces filled with shame and regret and a dawning understanding of their own prejudices. These were good people who had allowed fear and ignorance to dictate their behavior. They had made terrible choices, but they were capable of making better ones. You start tomorrow, he said. You remember that judging people by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character is wrong. And you do better. The crowd stood in silence, absorbing the grace and dignity of a man who had every right to be angry, every reason to reject their apologies, every justification for walking away from people who had treated him so poorly. Instead, he offered them redemption. The following morning brought a changed world to Maple Drive. Mrs. Patterson appeared at Marcus's door at 7:30 a.m., carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing an expression of nervous determination. "Good morning, Marcus. I brought you coffee. I was hoping we could talk." For the first time in 8 months, Marcus invited a neighbor into his home. They sat on his front porch as Emma and Ethan played in the yard, no longer afraid of the man their mother had finally introduced them to properly. "You're a real hero," Emma said, looking up at Marcus with wide eyes. "No, sweetheart," Marcus replied gently. "I'm just someone who tries to do the right thing." "That's what makes you a hero," said Mrs. Patterson quietly. Over the following days, the transformation of Maple Drive continued. Mr. Henderson knocked on Marcus's door to ask for help with his lawnmower, then ended up staying for 2 hours, listening to stories about Marcus's service and sharing his own experiences as a young man during the civil rights movement. "I was there when Dr. King spoke," Henderson said quietly. "I believed in his dream. I thought I still did. But somewhere along the way, I let fear make me forget what I once knew was right." The Thompson family, once they recovered from their ordeal, became Marcus's closest neighbors. Jack Thompson organized a neighborhood barbecue specifically to honor Marcus, and Linda spent hours teaching her daughters about the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. "Why didn't we know Uncle Marcus was a hero?" asked Katie one evening. "Because he's humble," her mother replied. "And because we weren't paying attention. But we're going to pay attention now." The change spread throughout the neighborhood like a healing wave. Property values, the subject that had once caused such worry, became irrelevant as residents realized they were living on the same street as a genuine American legend. Parents used Marcus's story to teach their children about courage, sacrifice, and the danger of prejudice. But perhaps the most profound change was in Marcus himself. For 8 months, he had lived in isolation, carrying the weight of his service and his sacrifices alone. Now, for the first time since his retirement, he felt truly at home. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Maple Drive hosted its first annual Heroes Among Us community celebration. The entire neighborhood had come together to organize an event that honored not just Marcus, but all the veterans and first responders who lived in their community. Marcus stood at the podium that had been set up in the center of the street, looking out at faces that had once turned away from him but now gazed up with respect and affection. Children who had once been hurried past his house now sat in the front row, hanging on his every word. "When I moved to this neighborhood," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air, "I thought I was just looking for a quiet place to retire. What I found instead was a community that taught me something important about forgiveness and second chances." He paused, looking specifically at Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Henderson, and the Thompson family. "We all make mistakes. We all have moments when fear makes us forget our better selves. But what matters isn't the mistakes we make, it's what we do after we realize we've made them." The crowd listened in respectful silence as Marcus continued. "Heroism isn't about medals or military service. Real heroism is about choosing to do better when you realize you've done wrong. It's about opening your heart to people who are different from you. It's about building bridges instead of walls." Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her eyes as she applauded. Mr. Henderson stood with his hand over his heart. The Thompson twins, Katie and Sarah, beamed up at the man they now called Uncle Marcus. "This neighborhood gave me something I thought I'd lost," Marcus concluded. "It gave me a family. And families forgive each other, support each other, and protect each other. Thank you for letting me be part of yours." The applause was thunderous, but more than that, it was genuine. These were people who had learned a hard lesson about their own prejudices and had chosen to become better because of it. 1 year later, Maple Drive had become something extraordinary. What began as a homogeneous suburban street had transformed into a model of integration and community spirit. New families moving to the neighborhood, families of all races and backgrounds, were welcomed not with suspicion but with celebration. Marcus had become the unofficial mayor of Maple Drive, organizing community watches, veteran support groups, and youth mentorship programs. His house, once isolated and ignored, had become the heart of the neighborhood. The Thompson twins, now 11, spent most of their after-school time at Uncle Marcus's house, learning about history, courage, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Mrs. Patterson's twins had become Marcus's unofficial grandchildren, calling him Grandpa Marcus and bringing him handmade cards on holidays. Mr. Henderson, now in his 70s, had found new purpose working with Marcus to establish a neighborhood scholarship fund for underprivileged children interested in military service or public safety careers. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the sign that now stood at the entrance to Maple Drive. Where once there had been a simple street marker, there was now a larger sign that read, Maple Drive, a community united. Home of Sergeant Major Marcus Williams, Medal of Honor recipient. Below that, in smaller letters, was a quote that Marcus had chosen, judged not by the color of skin, but by the content of character. On quiet evenings, Marcus still sat on his front porch, reading his newspaper and drinking his coffee. But now he was never alone. Neighbors stopped by to chat, children played in his yard, and the sound of laughter filled the air where once there had been only silence. The man who had once been invisible on his own street had become its most beloved resident. Not because of his military service, though that was certainly heroic. Not because of the lives he had saved, though that was certainly admirable. Marcus Williams had become beloved because he had shown his neighbors that redemption was possible, that people could change, and that love was stronger than fear. In a world often divided by race, class, and prejudice, Maple Drive had become a beacon of hope. And it all started with one quiet black veteran who refused to let hatred win, who chose grace over anger, and who showed an entire community what it truly meant to be a hero. The real lesson of Maple Drive wasn't about military service or tactical expertise. It was about the courage to examine your own heart, acknowledge your mistakes, and choose to be better. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who help us become heroes ourselves. Even in our darkest moments, kindness finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to True Story Zone, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.